this lecture on To Make a Beautiful Day, Feasts and Festivals in Ancient Egypt. To start out, let's have a little look at the ancient Egyptian calendar, which was a little different from ours. It was divided into 3 seasons, each consisting of 4 months. The seasons were Akhet inundation, Peret sowing, and Shemu harvest. Each of the months had a name that referred to a specific feast, usually for a god. So the month of Jehuti or Thoth would have been named for a feast of that god. This is interesting for once because we will be speaking of certain specific feasts and their dates, and also for a little conundrum that we will be looking at in a moment. So how do we know anything about ancient Egyptian feasts? For one thing, there are feast lists, like the ones here, that were set up in temples, usually carved. There might be mentions of feasts in various other documents, papyri that tell you how many offerings the temple gave out for certain feasts. And with all that together, you can get a certain idea of which ones existed and when they came. However, you have to remember that the ancient Egyptian religion was not uniform. It was not a single religion, but rather a series of practices in each of the temples. Some things were the same, but some were different according to each temple, according to each location, and according to each god. So the same feast might sometimes have 2 different dates, depending on where you were in Egypt, might last for a different time, and might have additional rituals depending on where you were. Now, one interesting thing is that certain of the feasts for which the months were named did not take place in that month, but at the beginning of the next one. Some scholars think that has to do with the fact that there was a civil calendar, which we just saw, and that this civil calendar did not take into account the fact that the year actually has 365 and a quarter days. We have a leap year every 4 years. Certain lunar calendars have a leap month at regular intervals, but the ancient Egyptians had nothing of the sort, which means that the agricultural year kind of wandered through the calendar year, or vice versa, depending where you're looking from. And that feasts were eventually adjusted to correspond more to the agricultural year, while the name of the month remained that of the old feast. However, one thing you noticed is that in those few cases in which that happens, and the most common is the 4th of Shemu, Wepet Renpet, the opening of the year, which is the name of the New Year's festival, takes place in the last month of the previous year. And in certain other cases, also, the festival for which it is named, if it does not take place in the actual month, it takes place at the beginning of the next month. So as we were saying, in the cases where the month with the name of the feast is the month before the feast actually takes place, the feast starts usually at the beginning of the next month. And so it is quite possible that the feasts did not actually start on the day it is named, on the dawn of the day, but, as is the common Christian tradition, but possibly on the night, the eve of the day before. And we do know that the ancient Egyptians had a word for the eve of a feast, and that there were certain ritual practices that started on the eve of feasts. So, whether or not this was for all of the festivities, we do not know, but we do know, or it seems quite likely, that the start of certain festivals actually began around sunset of the day before. Now, what did an ancient Egyptian feast look like? Each one, of course, had its own special characteristics, but there were also certain things that were more or less the same. Some of them were aspects that you also found in the daily cult. Now, the daily cult centered around a statue. This is the cult statue that was found in the Holy of Holies, the very deepest part of the temple. It was generally about 52 centimeters high and made of precious materials like gold and silver in the examples we have here. And this cult statue would be kept in a shrine in this Holy of Holies. There would be daily cult activities that took place, and this includes the purification of the priests or the pharaoh that would practice these cultic acts, offerings and censing for the god. The offerings included food, drink, clothing. The statue of the god itself would also be purified, would be washed, would be dressed, and would put on makeup. So basically, also on the day of festivals, a god would get up and get ready for the day, have breakfast, wash, make themselves beautiful. But there are also, and that is of course the whole point of a festival, acts that only take place on that day. But even these have a certain continuity throughout Egypt. There can be very specific offerings as opposed to the general food offerings. In this case, here on the right, we see Pharaoh offering little statuettes or symbols of the god Heh, which represents eternity, and the symbols for life, duration, and strength. Or it can be certain statuettes of people of the king doing certain acts. It can also be certain types of foodstuff. In this case, on the left, he's offering lettuce to the god Min. Or in certain cases, it can be a special kind of cake for Amun. We see here the preparation of this cake, and if you are interested, you can look up its recipe on our website. It's a honey and tiger nut cake. Very good. There will be apart from the usual hymns, daily hymns, there will be music and dancing, and certain specific ritual objects will be brought out from the temple vaults and certain rituals enacted among them. And if you see on the left, this is the raising of the jet pillar for the god Osiris. You see that on the far right of the image, the Osiris pillar has a little kilt. So cultic objects were dressed as well. And we'll be looking at what exactly is happening on the image on the right later on. Of course, any act is subject to being in danger from the forces of evil or chaos in this case. And for that, you need certain protective rites. Among them is a ritual run by the king. He's often holding certain specific ritual objects in his hands. And then rites including the smashing of pots. There's a smashing of red pots, and in here you can see pots that are inscribed specifically with the names of the enemies of Egypt or the foreign countries surrounding Egypt. Or there could be little figurines of the enemies of Egypt that would be buried or ritually broken. As part of these protective rituals and also affirmations of the king's power over the whole world would be the four things. These are different from ritual to ritual and from temple to temple. It can be the presenting of 4 different chests. It can be, as on the left, the loosing of 4 birds in the 4 cardinal points, the shooting of 4 arrows, or, as on the right, the batting of 4 balls in the 4 cardinal points. This is probably not a precursor to baseball, as there is a significant lack of evidence that it continued past ancient Egypt. It was probably reinvented at some point. Hitting balls with a stick seems to be pretty universal. And another special aspect of religious feasts is the fact that the god got to get out. Sometimes it would be a specific statue or emblem of the god that would be taken out, but this is one of the few instances in which the cult statue itself could leave the temple, or at least leave its Holy of Holies. It could do so in various ways. It could do so as a standard, in which case it's not the cult statue, but a specific standard that is taken out of storage. These are the earliest forms of movable cultic statues. The very first examples we have of depictions of processions show the gods being carried on standards. On the left, you can see that Thoth has its own, although the standard itself could be carried, it also had its own little shrine or socket in which it could be taken, which has a pole for carrying. Or on the right, we see a procession where the standards are carried directly. Here you can see what they looked like. This is from the tomb of Tutankhamun. They could be rather short and inserted into a longer socket, or they could have a longer base to start with. The statue could also be carried openly. In these cases, it is usually not the cult statue, but another statue that could be carried either, like on the left, in a palanquin, or simply carried before a priest on a priest's hands. In this case, the priest is not smaller than the others. He's simply less significant than the god and the pharaoh behind it in this depiction. But the most common were, starting the New Kingdom at least, and probably before, processional barks. They're miniature boats in which the cult statue could be set. These boats had carrying poles and would be carried on the shoulders of priests. In some cases, these boats could also be put on sledges or sleds. We know that statues used to be commonly carried on sledges as well, since the Old Kingdom, since the time of the pyramids. But afterwards, most especially the bark of Sokhar could also be put on a sled, or on the right we see a royal statue, a statue of a king, who is also taking part in a procession, being pulled on a sled. And then, of course, sometimes you need to go a bit further. You need to cross the Nile or journey to another temple. And in those cases, you have the river barge. They have names. The one of Amun is called Uzahat Amun. And the portable bark would be loaded onto the river barge and then unloaded once it arrived at its destination. The river barge was towed, either by tugboats or by people on land. This was usually considered a very great honor to be part of the towing crew, or a combination of the two, depending on how far they had to go. Where did these processions take place? Some of them took place within the temple or the temple precinct. So the statue could be taken from the Holy of Holies into either one of the side shrines, such as here the Wabet, for example, or to the offering hall, or to one of the courtyards or the forecourt of the temple. In this case, it was a purely internal ceremony. Certain high officials might have been invited to take part, but it is not something that the general populace would have witnessed. You could also have sailing processions. So there were, in those temples where those took place, there was probably the portable bark that could be taken on the shoulders of priests, and then another slightly bigger bark, but not as big as the sailing barge for the Nile, that could sail in the temple lake. And we know that there are several ceremonies that involve that, and feasts, including certain feasts for lion-headed goddesses that took place in the sacred lake within the temple precinct. Some of them also involved lighting torches at night, so you would have the nice reflection of the torches. It was probably quite pretty. But the god, of course, could also go and visit other temples. This includes temples of other gods. For example, the goddess Hathor in Dendera would go all the way down to Edfu to visit her husband, Horus. They'd have a nice wedding night, and then, in continuation of the festivities, she would sail back to Dendera. Or later we will be looking at the Opet festival, where the god Amun visited himself in another temple. When outside the temple, it's very rare for the statue to be visible. We have said that as well. That means that most of the portable bark shrines, first of all, had their own little shrine and some form of curtain to keep the sacred image from being seen by the general populace when it went outside the temple. Part of the procession, depending on how long it was, would also include stops. These could be in small kiosks that would be erected only for the festival, or it could be in stone waif stations. It would give the priests a bit of a rest, and censing and offerings would be given to the bark and the statue within. This was, although they could not actually see the statue, of course, the closest people could get to the statue of the god. And in some cases, they could even ask the god to help them. It's not uncommon that during festivals, there was a time where people could submit oracles for the god. Here we see an oracle papyrus. You see the procession of the god on the left, and on the right there are a couple of priests, and then you can just about see the white garments of some supplicants that have come to ask questions. The oracle questions were always presented as a yes or no possibility. You would present two papyri, one with the positive outcome and one with the negative outcome written on it, such as here, the oracle question to Sobek and Isis. The positive outcome would be a plea of the servant Teshufre, that's what he's called, son of Mare, who says before his master Sobek, Lord of Pi, great god, and Isis, perfect of throne, if my soundest course is to plough the bank of the lake this year, year 33, and I should now sow, let the slip be brought out to me. And then the second slip says, if it is not my soundest counsel to plough the bank of this lake, etc., then this slip should be brought out to me. So it was possible, at least at local and neighborhood temples, to ask for oracles, probably throughout the year, but it was a very special thing to be able to see the god himself, to present your oracle himself, and in those cases, it was probably set up so that the bark of the god would lean towards one or the other of the two slips. Generally speaking, I have said a few times that was very rare for a normal person to see or participate in the religious part of the festivities. There were very probably private feasts and certain other rituals that were done. We only know about them for very, very few of the festivals. But in some cases, we do know that part of the temple would be open to the population or part of the population on certain occasions. On the left, it would be for handing out consecrated bouquets. We know that for the Opet festival, the forecourt of the Temple of Luxor was opened at least to certain people, as we have graffito from priests and certain minor officials who apparently were very excited to be there and had to immortalize themselves. So now that we've had a general overview of what feasts looked like, let's have a look at some of the more specific feasts. Like many other cultures, the ancient Egyptians celebrated the start of the year. Ideally, this began with the inundation. We've heard of some of the problems with the ancient Egyptian calendar. And on a religious point of view, this was a time of renewal. And that meant that the statues got to be renewed as well. They were taken out of their sanctuaries and brought to a place where the rays of the sun could fall upon the statue and re-energize it. so the soul of the god could enter it more easily. On the left, we see a procession to the roof of the temple. In the Greco-Roman times, these are mostly kiosks, like you see on the right, where the statue would be placed. In certain older temples, there was very often a sun chapel with an open altar where this would take place. We do know of a few of the private practices during New Year's, and one of them was gift giving. These could be a bunch of official gifts. On the right, we see the New Year's gifts from the tomb of Khennamun. These were for the king. As a loyal courtier, of course, he wanted to make sure that the king was happy with him and brought him all sorts of wonderful gifts. And the king, of course, would give him some gifts as well. We know that the workers of Deir el-Medina, who worked directly under the vizier, would also offer gifts to the vizier. But at least starting the late period, we have a great amount of gifts from private people. These are relatively cheap faience rings, for example, or scarabs. Or here we see a New Year's flask that probably contained water from the inundation, and they would be inscribed with wishes for a happy new year. So this was the first day of the year. Obviously, it's probably started on the eve of the last year and went on for a few days. The exact length of the festivals varied greatly from time period to time period, from place to place, including the Opet festival, for which we have a length ranging from 11 to 27 days, depending on the period. The Opet festival was a purely Theban festival, and it involved the statues of Amun, Mut, his wife, and Khonsu, his son, traveling from the temple of Karnak to the temple of Luxor. And at first this took place on land with the return journey on the Nile, and starting the reign of Tutankhamun, it took place purely on the water. Here we can see the quay at Karnak, where the portable bark would be loaded on the barge of Amun. On the right, we can see part of the procession. It was not just the barge of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, but the king's barge and the queen's barge, the great royal wife, would have taken part as well. We do know that the king took part in most of the big festivals. There was a series of smaller festivals. Each temple had its own smaller ritual acts where the king was not necessarily present. The smaller temples to minor deities, he would not have been there either, but there were certain times in the year where we know that the king was present, and the Opet festival is one of them. Meanwhile, on land, there was a series of kiosks for offerings. On the top, you can see that cattle is being slaughtered. On the bottom, you see the kiosks with the offerings being set up. And of course, there was music and dance along the whole banks of the Nile, probably along the Sphinx Alley, even when the procession was entirely on the Nile. And then, of course, it would land at Luxor, would be greeted with music, dance, and certain rituals. The point of all of it was, for one thing, to reaffirm the kingship and to regenerate Amun in a primeval place. The temple of Luxor was considered to be a reflection of the primeval waters at the beginning of creation. Another festival of renewal is the festival of Koyak, and this festival is extremely well documented in the Greco-Roman period, where every single act to take place on every single day is documented. And it is interesting because it involves the making of grain mummies. So on the first days, they would make the little grain mummy of Osiris. It's basically just earth and wheat grains or barley grains mixed into it that would be formed in a mold and then formed so that it gives the approximate in the approximate shape of Osiris. In later times, Sokar, who apparently had a very similar ritual, was added on to this one. Once the grain mummies were molded, they would be watered for a certain amount of time until they sprouted. On the right, you see a bed of Osiris. It's basically the same idea, but it was placed in tombs. But just so you can have a general idea of what a sprouted Osiris would look like. In Greco-Roman times, there was a specific date then for making the Sokar figure. You see they get little masks as well as their own coffins. We do own one of these coffins, unfortunately without the grain mummy, but it is on display. Then the grain mummy from the previous year would be brought out to the necropolis. The origins of this festival was probably in Abydos, where the grain mummy would be brought to Peker, which was thought to be the burial place of the god Osiris. In practical view, this was one of the tombs of the earliest kings of Egypt, who was identified with Osiris, but where exactly the small necropolis for the grain mummies is not yet certain. We do know where they were for certain other temples. They each had their own little place in the desert where the grain mummies were buried. Meanwhile, the mummy for this year, which had just been made, would be mummified, would be wrapped, and would be placed inside various shrines in the temple to wait the next year where it would be buried. This is obviously a festival of renewal, a festival of rebirth, to honor the god of Osiris who had died and had come back to life again. Another festival of renewal, also a harvest festival, which I'm sure we will all enjoy, is the festival of Min. Min is, as you can see, a very ithyphallic god. What he stands for is pretty obvious if you look on the right. His festival started with the king arriving at the temple, certain rituals were done, and then the whole procession would set out with a white bull at its head. Now, a bull is traditionally a symbol of fertility, along with the ram in ancient Egypt. You only have to look at their attributes to understand why. Meanwhile, throughout the Min Fest, it is interesting to note that the statue of Min is always on display. This is not the case for the Opet Fest and Amun-Re, although it, at certain parts of the festival, could be only partially shrouded so that you could see the head. But here you can see the entire statue, and it's being carried on a kind of platform that is draped. If you look very closely, you can see the priests carrying the platform behind the curtains that hide them. The statue is being taken to a place called the Stairs. The Stairs was probably a reference to a raised threshing floor. And once they arrive there, the statue would be set up, there would be a ceremonial run, the releasing of 4 geese, and the proclamation of the king's kingship over all of Egypt and all of the world, which was basically saying that he was in a good position, that he was allowed to continue the rituals for this god. And after the 4 geese, he would shoot 4 arrows to all the cardinal points. Then we had certain ritual, and here the god is basically giving his essence, giving his life to mankind through embracing the king. And we see behind him lettuce. Before, at the very beginning, if you remember, there was also an offering of lettuce for Min. Lettuce was Min's sacred foodstuff, and was, in ancient Egypt, associated with sex. So next time you eat lettuce, you know what you're doing. And as a culmination of this festival, the king would then ceremonially harvest a sheaf of wheat with a golden sickle. He would receive his part on behalf of the gods. In the name of all mankind, he would accept it, and the gods would take their part. Now, there is another ritual for Min that we know about, and it's not quite clear if it's part of this festival or another one. The Egyptologists generally call it climbing for Min. The Egyptians called it raising the scaffolding for the dressing. And if you were wondering if it could possibly get any more suggestive, this is it, in which you can see on the left a pole was slowly raised. So there would be a number of foundation ceremonies for the whole. Pots would be broken, there would be an animal sacrificed, as if this was a building. Then in that hole, the pole would be set, and then it would be slowly raised until it was upright. On the left, those are the oldest depictions of it, and it goes no further. However, later depictions show that other poles were added to the central one, and that people would climb it. You can see the poles here, and you see people climbing the poles. And they were doing it so they could drape animal skins around it to form a sort of tent. This ritual is very possibly the Feast of Mene that has been named since the early dynastic period, since before 3000 BC. So it is one of the oldest known rituals in ancient Egypt, and probably originated at a time where temples were not necessarily made of stone, were not at a fixed point, and where ceremonial areas were erected as the need arose. We can see that ancient Egyptian festivals have a lot to do with renewal. But this time we're going to be looking at a more funerary view. We had the god Osiris who died and was buried, but in this case we have a necropolis festival. The beautiful Feast of the Valley is another one of those festivals that only existed in Thebes. It had two levels. It had the royal and religious level, in which the god Amun would go from Karnak would cross the Nile and would go to the temple of Hatshepsut in Deir el-Bahari, and most importantly, the chapel of Hathor yet there. There, Amun would be renewed, a bit like at the New Year's festival, with certain solar and cultic acts, and he would also join with the goddess Hathor. On a more private area, this was a procession that is very often named and where we know that people followed it. They say so very often. May I witness you on your beautiful feast of bringing you to Jezeru? And the tombs also often mention following Amun in his procession. And we know that private people would then go to the temples, both the temple of Karnak and the funerary temple of the reigning king, which was on the other side, as well as the temple of Hatshepsut, to get consecrated bouquets, which they would then later on present to their own dead in the necropolis. So this probably took place throughout the day. On a purely religious level, on the right, we see the loading of the portable bark of Amun and the king and everything else onto boats in order to be transported to the West Bank. This was accompanied by various offerings. We have some festive acts as well. There seems to be a whole series of mock battles or exhibition battles from the military during that time. We can see that here. In front of a way station, we have soldiers engaged in mock battle. Here we see the loading of the barks. We see two statues of ancestor kings with carrying poles. And once they arrived at Deir el-Bahari, there would also be a series of cultic acts and offerings for the ancestor kings. Depending on the time period, these kings would join the processions. Usually the father of the reigning king definitely took place, as well as the founder of Deir el-Medina, Amenhotep I, and his mother Nefertari. Ahmose Nefertari. And at some time periods, it might be even more. Then once the procession had arrived at Deir el-Bahari, the private citizens would take their consecrated bouquets, would take part of the offerings that had been offered and which were redistributed, and go to the tombs of their own ancestors, most likely their direct ancestors, whoever had grandfathers or whoever had died the most recently. There they would do their own offerings. They would bring the bouquets, which you can see on the left. We see a libation offering on the right. There are some burnt offerings. And when all that was done, they would have a picnic and feast with the deceased. So it was a way to reconnect with your own ancestors and with the dead that had gone on before. And in some ways, that is reminiscent, of course, to certain funerary ceremonies and festivals today, such as the Dias de Muertas and others, in which you would go to the place where people are buried and have a nice picnic and enjoy your time with the people who have passed. There are, of course, many more, including a feast of drunkenness. But I hope this gave you a slight insight into the variety of different feasts, even though they all have sort of the same basic ideas with a procession, with cultic acts, yet every one of them was different and had its very own flavor. And so I hope you'll tune in soon for our next lectures, and I wish you a good day.